After the last foray into the world of politics and Romanticism, I want to focus here again more on a theoretical aspect of Romanticism, what I have called here the aesthetics of unattainability. So the major hypothesis for this video would be that the Romantic project attempts to represent something that is unrepresentable, that is inexplicable and incomprehensible. This attempt translates the insights of the imagination into language, and this can only be done in poetic language, of course, for which nature is mysterious, intimating something yet never fully expressing it, which is in turn related to the sublime. So these are aspects that we have already touched upon in the very first look at Romanticism, but that I want to get into a little bit deeper in this one. So the consciousness of the poet as a mediator of the experience and of the poetic text as a mediation is found in many Romantic texts. It is also a central feature in, for example, Wordsworth's approach to nature and to representing nature. We can see this, for example, in one of his most well-known works, the poem Tintern Abbey, the full lines of which is lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July 13, 1798. So we can also here see how strongly the Romantics tried to create this impression that this is an spontaneous expression of an emotion in a certain point of time. Although we know from Wordsworth's own words that this is, of course, what we're reading is the effect of something that has been done after the fact, and that the poet has thought about this. So here in this poem, Wordsworth produces a nature poem that is not really a nature poem, but rather a profound and anxious meditation on loss, because what he does, mind that it says on revisiting the banks of the Wye. So the situation is that Wordsworth comes to this point where he had been a few years earlier. So what he does is he compares his own experience now with his more immediate experience when he was a younger man, when he was when nature still worked much more directly on him, and he actually experienced this in one way as a loss. I can't feel the same things that I felt back then, but also as a gain, because now he has grown, he has matured, and he can rethink the experience in more ways. And what he does, what he is now able to see, he says sort of in his youth, nature was a feeling for him. It immediately translated into feeling. But now that he has this sort of reflective view of nature, it enables him to see something larger, something deeper, something that I've called an experience of transcendence. So this is from the poem where he says, "I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts." So we see this ambiguous mixture of something that is negative, it disturbs me, but it's the joy of elevated thoughts. A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky and in the mind of man. So this sense sublime of something that is far more deeply interfused. Interfused with what? Where? What is this? It is there. It is somehow there in the setting suns. It is in the ocean. It's in the living air. All of these vast, grand images of sublime nature. And in the mind of man. This was, after all, one of Wordsworth's major points, that the mind of man sort of mirrors the sublimity of nature. So there is this sense, but it's not something that I can easily put my finger on and say, this is it, and this is how you describe it. But rather, I can say that I have this sense, and that I can find images for this sense, but I can't explain it fully. We can see a variation of this theme in two very famous romantic poems about birds. One of them is Percy Shelley's To a Skylark, and the other is John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. In both cases, the birds are analyzed by the poets for their significance. So they listen to the birds and they think about what the bird means and represents, asking what the bird stands for. The birds, of course, are artists, are symbols for artists through their music, and they're symbols for nature through their being animals and being part of nature. So when we look at Shelley and To a Skylark, we can see this in the way that he actually compares the bird to a poet, like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. So the bird is a poet, but it's a hidden poet. And it's a poet from which the speaker can draw inspiration, right? Remember how nature is that which inspires and gives these ideas. And so Shelley asks the bird, teach me half the gladness that thy brain must know. Such harmonious madness from my lips would flow, the world should listen then as I am listening now. So I'm asking for this natural inspiration, which will then transform into words, into the harmonious madness that the poet utters, which will make the world listen, just like the poet himself listens to this natural scene. So far, so good. But the final point of the bird is that the speaker can't see it. He can hear it, but he cannot see it. Now, one of the things about the skylark is that apparently it likes to sing while it is flying, and it is often flying very high, heights of 50 to 100 meters, high up there in the sky, which means that you're looking against the sun, and sometimes you're basically seeing sort of a dot in the sky, or nothing at all, while you can hear the bird. And that's very important for Shelley as he observes the bird, that this is something that he can hear the music, but he can't see the source of this, and he incorporates that into his reflection on the bird. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert. So it was never really a bird. It was always sort of a symbol that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. So this is the art that has no mediation and that will need the poet to mediate it. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire. The blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. And this is a longish poem. In the poem you get numerous comparisons of what the bird is like without ever saying this is the bird. Because that's the point. The bird is something that you can hear, you can think about, you can experience, it can inspire you, but you can't contain it. You can contain it in an easy description, the way that neoclassical aesthetics thought you could contain reality by showing it what it really is. So here we have really an aesthetic that looks at something that is uncontainable in words. I will not go into detail about the Ode to a Nightingale, other than say, go read it. One of the greatest poems of all time, certainly of Romanticism. But just point out that we have a similar experience here in that the speaker of this poem sits down in his garden to listen to a nightingale, and then starts thinking about the nightingale and using that experience to develop his own strain of thoughts. But the point of the nightingale is also that it's a bird that you can hear but not see, partly because it sings when it's getting dark, but also because it likes to sing when it's hidden deeply in the bushes. So it's another experience of an inspiration, the source of which you can't easily grasp and easily see. And yet another famous anecdote that sort of ties into this idea of expressing the inexpressible, trying to attain the unattainable, and one that is related to a specific form that was well known and well used in Romanticism, and that is the fragment. So something that is incomplete, a textual form that is incomplete and that is intentionally incomplete. Part of its message is its own incompleteness. This had already been used or foreshadowed in the trope of Gothic and sentimental fiction of the found manuscript. Remember how the very first Gothic novel was claimed to be a translation from a found manuscript. Something similar happens in sentimental fiction. The Man of Feeling, this arch sentimental novel, claims in the preface also to be a found manuscript that had been used as gun wadding. So basically the paper had been used to prepare the gun, which means that parts of the paper is missing, which explains why the text is in such a desolate state and is fragmentary. So here in Romanticism, this is merged with the Romantic poetics, because on the one hand it foregrounds the artwork as artwork. If you say, okay, this is something that is only fragmentary, you point to the very materiality of the artwork. And it rather performs the poetics of unattainability in its own form. And says, look, I can't fully express what I want to say, and I show this by making the text incomplete. It fuses life and art, because the biographical process of its production becomes part of its internal structure and meaning. And some of the most famous fragmentary poems come from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which is why you see him up here. Coleridge's poetic career is really tantalizing in that it is so full of partially fulfilled promises. He was one of the first generation of Romantics, an early young radical writer who produced great work, but produced also a lot of fragmentary work, and then later on wrote less and less poetical text and more other texts. So Coleridge really was sort of his vocation turned out to be making failure a source of his own success. And one of his most famous poems, Kubla Khan, has an origin story that he himself tells that sort of exemplifies this idea of the fragment and the poetics of unattainability. So this is from his own explanation of how this text came into existence. In the summer of the year 1797, the author, then in ill health, had retired to a lonely farmhouse between Porlock and Linton, on the Exmoor confines of Somerset and Devonshire. In consequence of a slight indisposition, an anodyne had been prescribed. And this anodyne, this medicine, by the way, is laudanum, which was commonly prescribed as a painkiller for a remedy for a number of ailments. And laudanum then is actually opium dissolved in alcohol, so quite a strong painkiller, if you will, and also one that will have effects on your imagination, certainly. So an anodyne had been prescribed, from the effects of which he fell asleep in his chair at the moment that he was reading the following sentence, or words of the same substance, in Pulcher's Pilgrimage. Here the Kubla Khan commanded a palace to be built, and a stately garden thereunto, and thus 10 miles of fertile ground were enclosed with a wall. The author continued for about 3 hours in a profound sleep, at least of the external senses, during which time he has the most vivid confidence that he could not have composed less than 200 or 300 lines, if that indeed can be called composition, in which all the images rose up before him as things, with a parallel production of the correspondent expressions without any sensation or consciousness of effort. So this is, of course, the idea of absolute artistic creation. In your mind, you see the things, and the things are identical to the expression, and you have it. You have that thing which you wanted to express, and you have found the perfect words for that. But that's, of course, not the end of the story. On awakening, he appeared to himself to have a distinct recollection of the whole, and taking his pen, ink, and paper, instantly and eagerly wrote down the lines that are here preserved. At this moment, he was unfortunately called out by a person on business from Porlock, and detained by him above an hour, and on his return to his room found, to his no small surprise and mortification, that though he still retained some vague and dim recollection of the general purport of the vision, yet, with the exception of some 8 or 10 scattered lines and images, all the rest had passed away like the images on the surface of a stream into which a stone has been cast, but alas, without the after restoration of the letter. So obviously, this inspiration that he then tries to transform into concrete expression, to set the words on paper, after this disturbance by the person from Porlock, and literary historians have tried to find out who was that person from Porlock, and we don't know, and there might as well be a fiction. After that interruption, the vision is gone, and he's unable to finish the poem, and all he has are these scattered lines that he can produce. So the following fragment is here published, as he says, at the request of a poet of great and deserved celebrity, which is Lord Byron, and as far as the author's own opinions are concerned, rather as a psychological curiosity than on the ground of any supposed poetic merits. So this is the reason why he shows this to the public. But of course, Kubla Khan is now regarded as one of the central expressions of Romantic poetry. I will not go into a detailed analysis of the poem. I'm just going to give you the first lines where you can see this the connection to these sentences that he had read about Kubla Khan. So it describes a similar scenery. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alf, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. And he develops a sort of a psychogeography, this strange place that sort of speaks to us and that seems to be expressive of something, but it's also inconclusive and very, very difficult to understand and very difficult to make sense of, partly because of its fragmentary nature, but also because it hints at meaning that it cannot fully express and fully deliver. And from this chasm, with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this might earth in fast thick pans were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift, half-intermitted burst huge fragments vaulted like a rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail. And mid these dancing rocks, at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. 5 miles, meandering with a mazy motion, through wood and dale the sacred river ran, then reached the caverns measureless to man, and sank in tumult to a lifeless ocean. So what is this? What is this place? What is the significance of all this? This has become certainly one of the most often interpreted and analyzed and thought about poems of Romantic writing.